first, some requests for you. To start, if you take photos of me, please do not put them in Facebook or Instagram. Instagram is really part of Facebook, of course. And Facebook is a monstrous surveillance engine. It does surveillance on the people it uses. Often they're called its users, but really they're the people it uses. And it does surveillance on everyone else too. If you put someone's photo in Facebook, you give Facebook one more handle to do surveillance on that person. We could argue about whether doing this to your friend is a good way to treat a friend, but if you're not my friend, that doesn't affect me. Putting photos of me in Facebook would affect me. Please don't do it. Second, if you make a recording, audio or video of this talk, and you want to distribute copies, please do so only in the ways that are favorable to free software. That means, first of all, choose a format that's good. Don't use MP anything. Above all, don't use Flash. And that means don't put it in YouTube. And don't use Windows Media Player or QuickTime. Also, make sure that the recordings can be downloaded without running any non-free JavaScript code, which is another problem that YouTube has. And also put on the recording the Creative Commons No Derivatives license, because this is a presentation of a point of view. So, there are many projects that aim to give everyone the benefit of participating in a digital society. They talk about digital inclusion and the digital divide which they want to close by giving everyone access to the wonders of digital technology. Well, this is based on the assumption that participating in a digital society is a good thing. But that's not necessarily true. It could be good or bad, depending on whether the digital society that we participate in is just or unjust. If it's unjust, then the correct goal is digital extraction, not digital inclusion. There are actually projects for digital inclusion that teach people to use Windows. And they're doing harm to the region where they operate, destroying a vital national resource, namely people who have never learned to use Windows, wasting it. So what are the threats to our freedom in the digital society, and what can we do about them? First, there is surveillance. Now, Facebook is not alone in doing surveillance of the users. Lots of companies and also organizations that claim to be nonprofit participate in surveillance. Often the and of course whatever information these organizations collect is made available to the state. So ultimately, business surveillance turns into state surveillance. And state surveillance is what's most dangerous, because the state can do much nastier things than just show you a different advertisement or affect your insurance rates or whether you can get a loan. The state could arrest you. So that's the ultimate danger. Now, surveillance is often done through people's own systems, their own computers. This works through proprietary software, typically, and it's software that has a malicious functionality we call spyware. That is, the software sends data to a server. some data about how the user is using the machine or what else the user is doing. We can protect against this by getting rid of the non-free software from our computers. When a program is free, that doesn't guarantee that it won't spy, but at least it means the users can fix it if it does. So the users are not helpless. And the users will sooner or later discover that it spies, and they'll get rid of the spying. And you can install the modified version that doesn't spy. But surveillance is also done through other systems that don't belong to the person. For instance, through ISPs and phone companies. They, in Europe, are required to build a dossier of all the person's contacts, which dossier is then available for the state to look at later. For instance, ISPs keep track of all the contacts that the user makes over the internet, which sites, and phone companies record all the phone calls and messages and where they go or come from, and they also record where the phone is. Now, the software in mobile phones has a surveillance feature. It will send the GPS location on remote request, and the user can't make it stop. So this is malicious functionality in a non-free program. If that were a free program, the user could make it stop. But the phone company can also localize the phone without its cooperation by triangulation. Whenever the phone sends a signal, that signal arrives at various towers, and each tower records the exact time when the signal arrives, and by comparing those, they can compute where the phone is. And each year they make more cells, and they can localize phones more accurately than before. When the surveillance is done in computers that are not ours, we can't resist it by having control over our own computers. The only way to resist it is by organizing politically. In addition, surveillance is done through systems that have nothing to do with users and exist only to surveil. For instance, in the UK, all car travel is tracked. There are cameras by the side of the roads to recognize license plates. These create a dossier about each car, and they can easily keep this information forever if they wish. It's compact enough. In addition, they can track any car in real time. So this is an immense system of surveillance, which is a threat to human rights. Now, the excuses for massive surveillance typically involve protecting us from horrible things. Sometimes it's a real horrible thing, such as terrorism, but the danger of a government that has too much power is bigger. Consider how dangerous are terrorists, how dangerous is a government. Terrorists killed almost 3,000 people in the U.S. 12 years ago, and then the U.S. government killed something like 4,500 by invading Iraq using the terrorism as an excuse. So that's 4,500 Americans and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis that the U.S. government said it wasn't even counting, although it was. So, which one's really the bigger danger? And there are other horrible threats that may not even really be threats at all. So, we must resist surveillance. Now, Snowden, a great hero, has shown us just how much the U.S. government does surveillance of Americans. It's not clear how much the French government does surveillance of people in France. It may well be much more. You know, the NSA and the FBI have legal limits on their surveillance, and but they have reinterpreted these legal limits so that they almost don't matter. In other countries, there may be no legal limits, and the corresponding surveillance activities may be looking at everything. We know that the NSA has tried to corrupt the software that people use. Of course, it's proprietary software. You shouldn't trust it at all. And even perhaps hardware. We suspect that Intel's hardware may have been corrupted. Of course, the name of the company was suggesting this to us all the time. Calling a company Intel, what is it doing to you? It's spying on you. Well, that's just a joke. But the danger that the hardware has been corrupted is real. So, we've got to organize to demand an end to surveillance on the internet, an end to collecting data massively about people. Systems must be redesigned so that they don't collect the data, and above all, so that they don't store the data in a centralized way or in a way on the internet so that it's easy to collect and centralize. It's not enough to limit, to place requirements on the government for looking at the data. Because the worst thing that the government does with this data is catch whistleblowers. This is why Snowden knew he had to flee the U.S. before it became known that he had released anything. But the government doesn't say, we hate him because he's a whistleblower. The government accuses the whistleblower of some crime and then says, we suspect a crime has been committed, so now we can justify looking at all these databases. So you see, legal limits on using the surveillance data won't help to protect whistleblowers, and that means they fail to do the job. We must change systems that we use, that people use, so that they don't collect personal data. And we have to refuse to use the systems that do, which is the reason for this button. Don't be tracked, pay cash. If you pay with a card, the system knows where you are and what you bought. I don't want any systems to know that, so I pay cash. The next threat to our freedom comes from censorship. Censorship is not new, but 15 years ago it looked like the internet would defeat censorship. It looked like it was too hard in practice to censor the internet and people would be able to communicate freely. Well, now we know that any country can censor the internet effectively if it's willing to go to enough expense and make a lot of people hate it. And there are many governments that do this. And it's not just the obvious tyrannies like China and Iran that censor the internet. Finland censors the internet. Finland imposed filters, I think it was in 2007, blocking access to a long list of websites, of pages. And somebody in Finland did experiments and found out that certain pages were blocked. So he posted a list of the pages he had found were blocked. And the Finnish government ordered his site blocked as well. And the Supreme Court of Finland recently decided against him. So the final decision is that even though the law says nothing about blocking access to sites that post news about internet censorship, that the state is allowed to order ISPs to block access to his site. So, basically, these governments that censor the internet want to keep the people in the dark about how they are being attacked. And similar things are done in many countries. The Turkish government 4 years ago announced that every internet subscriber would have to choose between censorship and more censorship and even more censorship and yet more censorship. 4 different levels of censorship, but access to the real internet would not be an option. There were protests in the street against this, but the government didn't care. Of course, now we see that the Turkish government is heading towards out-and-out tyranny. The Australian government several years ago considered imposing filters on the internet, but this was defeated by political opposition. However, there's another kind of censorship in Australia, censorship of links. There are sites it's forbidden to make a link to. Electronic Frontier Australia was ordered by a court to remove a link to a foreign political website on pain of being fined $11,000 a day. And this site, what is it that was so horrible? No, it was not in favor of terrorism. It's an anti-abortion website. And that's a disgusting position, but they have the right to advocate it even to Australians. In many countries, various kinds of statements will be on websites will be shut down. For instance, in India, anything that offends anybody's religion is arbitrarily shut down without even a trial. In France, positions on questions in history are forbidden. There are questions about history that can't be sincerely discussed in France at all, because either you're repeating what the state orders you to say or you're committing a crime, and neither of these is sincere discussion. So these topics can't be discussed in France. Historians started L'Appel de Blois, a petition against laws ordering people to take a position on historical questions, but it was not heeded. So we see censorship constantly spreading. The UK recently announced a plan to impose censorship by default. Private internet subscribers would be allowed to turn off the censorship, but people who depend on public access sites would have no way to get around the censorship. Now, even when the censorship is supposed to be against pornography, although that's an outrage, there's nothing wrong with pornography, they always censor other things as well. Whatever the thing that's supposed to be censored, all sorts of other things that have some verbal relationship to the topic get censored as well. Now, often the real reason behind these campaigns to filter the internet is to attack sharing. I'll talk about that topic later. But do note that we know that this has been an excuse to advocate censorship of other things. At a meeting of the International Organization of Record Companies, the IFPI, somebody said that he really loved child pornography as an excuse to impose filters on the net, because once filters could be ordered, then they could use those filters to block what they really want to block. So it's not just a suspicion that that's an excuse for other kinds of filters, it's established fact. The next threat to our freedom in the digital society comes from data formats that restrict the user. We also refer to these as digital restrictions management or digital handcuffs. Many applications save the data that the user enters in a secret format. These are proprietary applications, of course. Digital handcuffs are always implemented in a proprietary program, because if the purpose of a program is to restrict the user, this can only be done if the users can't change it. So whoever is trying to use software to restrict other people has to make that software proprietary. Anyway, these proprietary applications save the data that the user enters in a secret format which only that program can handle, to prevent the user from taking that data to any other competing program. So it's explicitly to hold the user's data captive. Typically they do this when the company does this when it finds it's in a commanding market position and thinks competition can only be bad for us. Let's prevent competition by preventing interoperability. If nobody can interoperate with us because we always have the users saving their data in this secret format, we'll be dominant forever, is their thought. Secret formats are also used to distribute lots of publications, music, videos, books. And again, the only programs that can handle this format are proprietary, and they're designed to restrict the users. So this is an injustice. I believe it should be illegal. We should ban this practice because it's an abuse of a power that nobody should have in the first place. But anyway, it's common. The other kind of format that restricts users is a bit more complicated in how it does so. These formats are not secret, but they're patented. These include MP3 for audio, MPEG-2 and MPEG-4 for video. Now, there is free software to handle these formats, and you can find it. However, because it's patented, some distributors of free operating systems don't dare include this software. They're afraid, and rationally afraid, that they will be sued. So, what do? Since they can't include the free software, they have two choices. Either no software to handle these formats, or include a proprietary program that they've paid to license to handle these formats. Both choices are bad. If they include nothing to handle these formats, the users install that version of gnu+linux and they see it doesn't handle this format, and they say, what good is this system? It can't play an MP3 file. But if it includes non-free software to play MP3, well, now they're not respecting users' freedom anymore. They've left the free world. So they're two bad choices. Two choices that involve mistreating users and put our community in a bad position. Well, why does it matter? It matters because there are lots of MP3 files. So in other words, there are two jaws. One is the common use of these formats, and the other is the fact that these distros can't include the free software to handle the formats. And the community is squeezed between the two. That's why I say don't distribute copies of my talk in these patented formats. That's why you should never create files in those formats or let anyone do so for you. If you create the patented formats, you're increasing the pressure of this jaw, which is squeezing our community against the other jaw. So insist on making your files in safe formats that are not secret and that are not patented. There's one other peculiar case, and that is Flash. Flash is neither secret nor patented, but Adobe changed it so many times that we couldn't keep up. We have a free player for Flash version 8, and Adobe has Flash version 10, which is not just a small change. They started over. It's totally different. So the fact is, we've been unable to provide support for it, so make sure you don't generate it. Websites shouldn't have Flash. The next threat to our freedom comes from non-free software, proprietary, user-subjugating software. In other words, software that the users don't control. When I say free software, I mean libre, not gratuit. I'm talking about freedom, so think of free speech, not free beer. With software, there are two possibilities. Either the users control the program, or the program controls the users. It's always one or the other. In order for the users to control the program, they need the four essential freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish for whatever purpose. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code of the program and change it so it does your computing as you wish. With these two freedoms, each user has individual control over that program. But individual control is not enough, mainly because most users don't know how to program. So if they're limited to individual control, it doesn't do them much good. Therefore, we also need collective control. That means any group of users can work together to exercise control over the program and make it do what they want it to do. And then they can also offer copies to everyone else if they wish. This requires two additional freedoms. Freedom 2 is the freedom to redistribute exact copies, and Freedom 3 is the freedom to distribute modified versions. So these two freedoms allow the members of the group to cooperate and also offer to cooperate with everyone else. So when the users control the program, they make it do what they want it to do, and they can stop it from mistreating them if it did. But if the users don't fully control the program, then the program controls the users, and the owner controls the program, which means that through the program, the owner exercises power over the users. Thus, the program is an instrument of unjust power, a tool to subjugate the users, a yoke. Thus, non-free software is an injustice and should not exist. Now, nowadays, the owner is generally aware of the power it exercises and looks for ways to take advantage of that power to push the users down some more and gain additional advantage over them. So we find that malicious functionalities are commonplace in proprietary software. I've told you about two kinds already. There are the spy features and there are the digital handcuffs or digital restrictions management, DRM. There's another kind, backdoors. Backdoors receive commands from somebody else to do something to the user without asking permission, without informing the user, something that the user might not like. So, where do you find these? Well, there are lots of examples I can give you. In fact, enough to prove that malware is the usual case in the use of proprietary software, or more precisely, just about everyone that uses proprietary software is using known proprietary malware. Some examples. One proprietary package that has all three kinds of malicious functionalities that you may have heard of is called Microsoft Windows. It has known spy features. It has digital handcuffs. It has a universal backdoor, which means that Microsoft can remotely change the software without asking permission. So any malicious functionality that is not in Windows today could be remotely installed tomorrow. So Windows is not only malware, it's universal malware. Oh, and Microsoft informs the NSA about bugs in Windows before it fixes them. So basically, Microsoft is sabotaging its users. And if you use Windows in a government agency or anything important, you're nuts. The operating systems from Apple are malware. Well, macOS has digital handcuffs, but the software of the iThings, the monsters that Apple unleashed a few years ago, is much worse. It has surveillance functionalities, but worst of all, the digital handcuffs are the tightest ever. Apple took control even over the installation of application programs. The users are not allowed to install whatever program they wish. They can only install programs approved by Apple, which means that these computers are platforms for Apple censorship. This also should be illegal. Anyway, there's also an acknowledged backdoor. So the operating systems of Apple computers are malware. Flash Player is malware. It has a surveillance feature and digital handcuffs. Now, Flash Player is gratis, but it's not free software. This example demonstrates that being gratis is of no importance. The fact that Flash Player is gratis means that Adobe does not make users pay to be abused. What matters is whether a program is free or not. Another example is the Amazon swindle, a so-called e-reader, which swindles readers out of the traditional freedoms of readers of books. For instance, there's the freedom to acquire a book anonymously by paying cash. Amazon won't accept cash. The books that Amazon sells for the swindle can't be obtained from Amazon anonymously. Then there's so Amazon has a giant database that lists all the books each user has read. And more than that, because the surveillance is even great. It features in the swindle itself, tell Amazon which page is being read at any time. And if the user writes any notes, Amazon can get those notes too. Then there's the freedom to give a book to someone else after you read it, or to lend it to various people, or to sell it to a used bookstore. Amazon eliminates these freedoms with digital handcuffs in the swindle, together with end-user license agreements that say that the user can't really own a book. The user can only get a license to read the book under Amazon's choice of conditions. So Amazon shows in this way its contempt for private property. It says, all of your books belong to us. And you'll find a lot of parallels between such systems and also proprietary software and the Soviet Union. Anyway, there's also the freedom to keep a book as long as you wish. Amazon eliminates this with a backdoor. We know about the backdoor by observation, because in 2009, Amazon remotely erased thousands of copies of a particular book. These had been authorized copies until the day Amazon decided to erase them. In an Orwellian act. And what was the book? It was 1984 by George Orwell. There was a lot of criticism, so Amazon promised it would never do this again unless ordered to by the state. If you've read 1984, that promise is not very comforting, because the crimes of that dictatorship started with destroying any books it didn't like. But don't worry, Amazon doesn't keep the promise anyway. So, the official name of this product is the Kindle. Kindle means to start a fire, which apparently is meant to suggest that the real purpose of this product is to remotely burn people's books. Its competitors are not much better. Effectively, they're the same. You shouldn't use any of them. These are antisocial products. Anyone who starts reading using one of these devices is essentially saying he won't lend you books anymore, which means he's cutting off his friendship. Make sure all your friends are warned in advance that to use such a product to read books would mean cutting off their friendships with other people who read. Warn them in advance so that they won't make the mistake of buying that product. And then there are nearly all portable phones. I already told you about their surveillance feature, but they have a universal backdoor as well. Somebody can remotely impose software changes in the phone, any software change. And this has been used to convert them into listening devices. When the phone is converted, it listens all the time and transmits everything it hears. You don't have to talk into the microphone. It can listen from across the room. And if you try to get privacy by turning it off, guess what? It pretends to turn off, but really it's still running and still listening and transmitting. And if you try to prevent it from listening to you by putting it inside a Faraday cage so it can't communicate, how do you know it won't save up the recordings and transmit them later? Who knows what it will do? In order to make sure it isn't listening, you have to take out or discharge all the batteries. There may be batteries that you don't know about. Some phones have multiple batteries. Some phones have batteries that can't be removed. When I found out what mobile phones could do, I concluded that they were Stalin's dream and that it's our duty not to have them, so I don't have one. I will not carry a portable tracking and surveillance device. There are some things that we must not accept, no matter how convenient they would be. So, I've just proved how common malicious functionalities are and how important they are. Almost everyone that uses proprietary software is the victim of proprietary malware. But there are thousands of other proprietary programs which might have malicious functionalities or might not, and there's no way we can check because we don't have the source code. So this proves that proprietary software is just trust me software. We're a corporation. You know no corporation would ever mistreat people. You can trust us. That's the kind of sucker treatment that they give. You can't trust any of them. You can't trust a proprietary program. I'm sure there are some that are honest, but you can never tell which ones they are. But what about free software? Well, just as the proprietary software owners know the power that they exercise over the users, free software developers know they don't have power. That at most they can have some influence, but not power. The users can change whatever they do. The users can check it. So if it's mistreating us, we can find out and we can fix it. We can make a modified version that doesn't mistreat us. And the contributors know this. As a result, they don't feel so tempted. It's power that corrupts, and we don't have power over anybody. Now, this gives us a defense. It's not perfect. There is some free software that spies on people, for instance. Ubuntu, which is a variant of the gnu+linux operating system, has spyware. When the user searches for something, even locally, it sends Canonical, the company that develops Ubuntu, the user's search terms. And Canonical sends those to Amazon and tells Amazon to display advertisements on the user's screen based on those search terms. So Amazon learns something about this person's activities, and Canonical learns even more about this person's activities. That's spyware. Of course, people have made modified versions that don't spy. But the point is, don't use Ubuntu. Look at gnu.org/philosophy/ubuntu-spyware.html. If we reject this firmly enough, we can convince Canonical to change. But even though this defense is not perfect, it's a lot better than being defenseless, like the users of proprietary software. So I started the free software movement in 1983. I wanted to make it possible to use a computer in freedom, which required developing a free operating system, because all the operating systems at that time were proprietary. If you bought a new computer, to make it do anything, you had to have an operating system installed, which was always proprietary, and there went your freedom. So how could I change this? I was one man, without much fame, without much money, and few people agreed with me. So I didn't think that an ordinary political movement protesting in the streets and writing letters to officials would succeed, and I had no experience doing that anyway. I was not a political organizer, I was an operating system developer. But that meant I had another way to correct this problem. All I had to do was write an operating system. Then, as the author, I could legally make it free software, and then everyone would be able to use my system, use computers in freedom by running my system. So I decided to develop a 100% free operating system. That means each piece of software in the system had to be free. If one piece were proprietary, that would take away users' freedom. To fully respect freedom, every piece of software must be free. Then I decided to recruit others to help write it. It didn't have to be written entirely by me, it just had to be entirely free software. Then I decided to make it a Unix-like system to get the technical advantages of Unix and make it compatible so Unix users could easily switch. Unix was a popular proprietary operating system. We couldn't use Unix and have freedom, but making a Unix-like system was possible and seemed like the right choice. And then I gave it a name which is a joke. The system is called GNU, which is a recursive acronym that stands for GNU's Not Unix. But it's funny. The name is more funny because it has another meaning. It's the name of this animal which lives in Africa. So, and even better, according to the dictionary, the G is silent and the word is pronounced new. So every time you want to write the word new, instead of spelling it N-E-W, you can spell it G-N-U, and you've got a joke. Perhaps not a very good joke, but there are lots of them. So we have been taught to associate this name with laughter. It's the perfect name for any programming project. But when it's the name of our system, please do not follow the dictionary. Because if you say, I'm using the new operating system, you're already mistaken. Because we've been working on GNU for almost 30 years now, and using it for 21 years, so it's not new anymore. So call it GNU. Say the GNU system. There's another pronunciation error you need to avoid, which sounds like Linux. Strange to say, millions of people, when they talk about the GNU system, they call it Linux, which is a particularly galling kind of error because it gives the credit for our work to someone else. You see, there is a program called Linux. In 1992, we had almost all the GNU system, but one essential piece was missing. That was the kernel. The kernel is the component that allocates the machine's resources to all the other programs. And in 1992, Mr. Torvalds, who had written a proprietary kernel called Linux, made it free. He liberated it. So at that point, Linux could fill the last gap in the GNU system. So with GNU plus Linux, it was a complete free system, which was basically GNU, but also contained Linux. So the appropriate name would be GNU plus Linux or GNU/Linux. But the people who combined Linux with all the pieces of that were waiting to be the GNU system, they were focused so much on Linux that they thought of all the rest as a small add-on for this one piece. And they started talking about it as a Linux system, disregarding our work. Well, that's not nice, so please don't do that. Please call it GNU plus Linux or GNU/Linux. This will help us spread these ideas to the people who use or have heard of our system. And that's important because it's not enough just to give people freedom. We've got to teach them to appreciate it. And that's what we try to do all the time. That's what I'm doing in this talk. But it helps if people know that we've done something for them that they appreciate. They'll pay more attention to what we say about freedom. So you can pave the way for us to achieve more as we try to spread these ideas simply by calling the system GNU/Linux. Nowadays, there's another obstacle when we try to spread these ideas. In the English-speaking world, most people who talk about free software don't say free software. They say open source, which is the slogan of a different philosophy that rejects our ethical approach to the issue. During the 1990s, there were two camps in the free software community. There was the free software movement that talks about ideas of freedom and did then, and there were the other people who disagreed. They used and distributed and developed free software, but they did not consider proprietary software an injustice. They didn't think of this as a matter of right or wrong. And there was a debate between the two camps. But in 1998, the people in the other camp coined the term open source so that they could talk about the same software, but without even hinting at an ethical issue, so that the issue would never be raised. And I know that at least some of them wanted the ethical issue to be forgotten because they wanted to talk mainly to business. They thought business is what matters, people don't. So they wanted to direct their views mainly to businesses, and they thought that radical ideas such as proprietary software is an injustice, software should be free and respect your freedom, they thought that would just make business uncomfortable. They wanted these ideas swept away. With their new term, they had the opportunity to formulate a different discourse, one that didn't raise these issues and was based solely on practical convenience values. So everything they talk about is aimed at practical convenience, not at freedom, not at justice, not at treating people right. And since they were the majority and had the support of most of the businesses in the free software community, the politicians and journalists mostly adopted their term. And since then, even when people hear about us, they're misinformed about what we stand for. They're told that we stand for open source. What's the use of my existing if people think that I'm an open source supporter. So of course I do everything I can to inform them. I've seen articles that called me the father of open source. So I write a letter to the editor saying, if I'm the father of open source, it was conceived through artificial insemination using stolen sperm without my knowledge or consent. Then I explain the ideas of the free software movement, because that's the point, to show the readers of that periodical these ideas that were covered up in the article by the term open source. But I can't do it all. We need your help. Just by talking about free software or logiciel libre, you can spread the idea that there's an issue of freedom here, that there's something that some business practices might be wrong, and just because it's profitable, that's not an excuse. Now, the biggest obstacle nowadays to running computers with purely free software is that many computers contain pieces of hardware whose specs are secret. They won't tell us how to use that hardware. They only distribute non-free programs to run that hardware. Now, this to me seems like an abusive practice, and I would suggest making it illegal. But in any case, what we need to do, if we can't convince the manufacturer, which sometimes we succeed in doing, but that's rare, the rest of the time we need to do reverse engineering. We need to figure out the specs, and then someone else can write free software using those specs to run that piece of hardware. So, if you want to make a technical contribution that's big and really important, one that will really make a big difference, do reverse engineering to figure out how to run these peripherals. And I suggest that every university that teaches computing establish a project course for a year in reverse engineering. Groups of 4 or 5 students can work on a reverse engineering project for the year, and they can make some progress and learn reverse engineering. There's a big demand for this skill. So there's every reason to teach people how to do it. Now, since I just mentioned schools, I should explain why schools must teach exclusively free software. And that means everything from nursery school to the university, and also adult education. Every educational activity must teach exclusively free software. And this is not just because they might save money. That's a possible secondary benefit. But this is not about how to make education a little better. This is about how to do good education instead of bad education. Because teaching people to use proprietary software is bad education. It's implanting dependence. That goes against the school's social mission, which is to educate good citizens of a strong, capable, independent, cooperating, and free society. In the computing field, that means teaching people to use free software and graduating people who are ready to participate in a free digital society. Of course, there are some proprietary software developers that aim to use schools to impose dependence on society. So they offer gratis copies of their non-free programs to the schools. Just as drug dealers may offer gratis needles full of addictive drugs, saying the first dose is gratis. It's the same logic, and the school should reject proprietary software even if it's gratis, the same way it rejects the drugs even if they're gratis. But there's another deeper reason for the education of the best programmers. Some people have a talent for programming, and at 10 to 13, they're fascinated with computing, and if they use a program, they want to know, how does it do this? But if these kids ask the teacher, how does it do this? And the program is proprietary, the teacher has to say, we're not allowed to find out. It's a secret. So education can't start. Every program embodies knowledge. If it's proprietary, that's knowledge withheld from the student. So a proprietary program is the enemy of the spirit of education and must not be tolerated in a school. But if it's free software, the teacher can explain whatever part he knows and then say, here's a copy of the source code for each of you. Read it and you'll understand everything. And those kids will read it because they're fascinated and they yearn to understand everything. And the teacher can tell them, if you come across any part of the code that you can't figure out, show it to me and we'll figure it out together. This is very important because these natural-born programmers need to develop into good programmers. And how do you do that? Yeah, that means learning to write clear code. And the way you learn that is by reading lots of code and recognizing what's not clear. If you can't understand something and you're a natural-born programmer, that means it's not clear, it's badly written, and you learn, don't write it that way. So, to learn to write good, clear code, you have to read lots of code and write lots of code. Only free software offers the chance to read the code of large programs we really use. Then you have to write lots of code, which means writing code in large programs. But when you start to write changes in large programs, you have to start small, which means writing small changes in large programs. If you write a small program, that's not even starting to tackle the challenges of large programs. You have to do it by working on existing large programs. And only free software gives you the chance to write changes in large programs we really use. So any school can give students the chance to master the skill of programming, but only if it's a free software school. However, there's an even deeper reason for moral education, education in citizenship. Schools must teach the spirit of goodwill, the habit of helping others. Therefore, every class must have this rule. Students, if you bring software to class, you may not keep it for yourself. You must share it with the rest of the class, including the source code in case someone wants to learn, because this class is a place where we share our knowledge. Therefore, bringing proprietary software to class, unless it's for the purpose of reverse engineering, is not permitted. To set a good example, the school has to follow its own rule. It must bring only free software to class, except for reverse engineering, and share copies of the source code with everyone in the class that wants copies. And if you have any relationship with the school, if you're a student, a teacher, an employee, an administrator, or the parent of a student, it's your duty to campaign to pressure that school to stop teaching proprietary software. And that will require spreading the ideas to other people so as to make them aware of the issue, find allies, and make your campaign bigger until you win. So, the next threats come from the use of network servers, websites typically. And there are three different threats. One is, many of them send non-free programs written in JavaScript to the user's browser, and they actually will run non-free programs on your computer unless you stop them. They don't show you any sign that this is happening. The JavaScript is included in the web page or referenced from the web page. It gets loaded into the browser and it runs, and some of it is malicious. But nowadays we have a way you can protect yourself. It's the program Libre.js. This is an add-on for Firefox or its variants. It analyzes all the JavaScript code that tries to install itself in the browser to see if it's either trivial or free. And in those cases, the code is allowed to run. But if it's non-trivial and non-free, Libre.js blocks it and warns you This page tried to run a non-trivial, non-free JavaScript program, which has been blocked. It does one other thing. It searches heuristically through the site to find how to contact the webmasters to send a complaint. And that's something that's very important to do, to complain to the webmasters. However, it's typically a painful thing to do. It takes a lot of time to find out how to send the complaint, but not anymore because Libre.js does that for you. So it props up a button that says, here's the way to send a complaint, and you can just click there and type in your complaint. A short complaint is enough. I couldn't use your site because it has non-free JavaScript code and it wouldn't work without that. Please fix it. Well, that takes you less than a minute. With complaining so easy, you can complain 10 times a day. That'll take you less than 10 minutes, and it's important help for the cause. How are we going to convince all the webmasters to free or remove this JavaScript code? Lots of complaints will do it. If you send 10 complaints a day, you'll be doing an important contribution and it won't take you very long. The next threat is that these sites collect lots of data about people. Now, some of them they get by surveillance, and they get more than you might think. Many sites, when you go to the home page, there are things in the home page that give information to various companies. Sometimes 10 or more companies may be contacted. And this tends to happen especially in the very popular sites. They often are the worst. For example, if you look at a page and you see a Facebook like button, that's a surveillance method. Facebook knows that your computer visited that page. The reason is the image of the like button comes from a Facebook server, and it sends that image to your computer, and it knows your IP address. In addition, it knows which page you're looking at, because the browser tells it. That's part of how this is set up. So Facebook knows that your computer visited this page. But this is part of the issue of surveillance I already discussed. These sites typically demand a lot of personal information, sometimes because they're set up to do the job in a way that requires that personal information, and sometimes because they just demand to get it because they'd like to have more personal information. Well, the more personal information they collect, the more harm they can do to you by showing it to somebody you didn't want it to be given to. For instance, if this page has a like button, you look at this page and it's given information about you to Facebook without even telling you, probably. But if the site itself gets the information, it can still show that to Big Brother, for instance. In fact, if it's a U.S. company, it will be required to show it to Big Brother. So that's one thing we know. You can't trust a U.S. company. And as for companies in other countries, who knows? I won't claim that we can trust them. That's just a different question. So what this means is you shouldn't trust your data to these services, except perhaps if it's encrypted. There are services that say, store your data here. Well, it's total folly to store your data in any company's server, except in the case where you encrypt it first using free software, and all the company ever gets is the encrypted file. Well, then the company can't find out what's in it, and Big Brother can't find out what's in it either. Although you shouldn't do it very often. You should use this for long-term backup, because they will find out where you're contacting the site from. And that information they'll probably save and give to Big Brother. But if you don't contact the site very often, they don't find out very much. Well, thanks to Snowden, people are generally aware of this threat. But there's another threat that most people have never even thought about. And that is the threat that the site can take control of your computing. If you let your computing be done in somebody else's server, the server controls it. He controls your computing, and you don't. It's the same problem that happens if you run a non-free program. Because although you have a copy of the non-free program, you don't control what it does. So you don't control that computing. That's the consequence. You lose control of your computing. Well, if you let that computing be done in somebody else's server, it's done by his copies, and you can't see or touch them. So you don't control that computing. So these are two paths to the same end result, that you lose control of your computing. Either you run your copy of a proprietary program, and you can see it, but you can't touch it or understand it. Or you let the computing be done in somebody else's server by his copies of various programs, and then you can't see or touch them, and you end up without control of that computing. This practice is known as SaaS, or Service as a Software Substitute. It means service doing something you could have done by running a program. Now, that program may or may not exist yet, but if in principle you could do it by running a program, then it's your computing you should have control over because you could have control over it. What other kinds of computing are there? There are joint activities which involve communicating with other people. You can't have total control over an activity which involves other people. So those things you're going to be doing with others and not, in general, inside your own computer. But when you're the only person involved and you want to operate on data that you've got, those are things you could do in your own computer. You could have total control over them, and therefore, if you let them be done in somebody else's computer, you're giving him control over your computing. And this is what you shouldn't do, just as you shouldn't use a non-free program. They're both bad for you in the same way, because they give someone else power over part of your life. So, you need to reject SaaS. And there's no remedy. There's nothing that can make SaaS respect your freedom. Just as there's nothing that can make a proprietary program respect your freedom except making it not be proprietary anymore. There's nothing that can make SaaS respect your freedom except making it not SaaS anymore. Now, I've said that SaaS is equivalent in its results to using a proprietary program, but actually it's even worse. I've told you how some proprietary programs spy on the user. They have surveillance features that send data to some server. With SaaS, the user has to send all the pertinent data to operate on to the server. The result's the same. The server gets this data and will probably show it to one or another big brother. But I also told you about how some proprietary software has universal backdoors. For instance, Microsoft Windows, the software in portable phones, Google Chrome for Windows also has a universal backdoor. What the universal backdoor means is that somebody can remotely change how the user's computing is done without asking the user's permission to change it. But with SaaS, the computing is done in someone else's server, and he can at any time install different software in that computer and change how the user's computing gets done without asking the user for permission. So SaaS is inherently equivalent to a non-free program with surveillance functionalities and a universal backdoor. So it's equivalent to proprietary malware. But note that most web services are not SaaS, because mostly they do some kind of communication. But watch out, because the companies want to get personal data, often they implement something in a way that requires getting personal data, but there's another way to do the same job that doesn't require any surveillance. For instance, several years ago, I read about a service where people send their measurements, and then the site will show them and help them order clothing for their measurements. Well, to implement it that way requires people's measurements. You might think it's necessary to do the job, except the same job could be done by running a program in the user's own computer and the program, of course, would ask the user's measurements, but these would never be transmitted anywhere else. So one implementation does require users to give their personal data, but there's another implementation that avoids the need. Well, if we're serious about escaping from a surveillance society, we'll insist that things be implemented in the way that doesn't surveil us. The next threat to our freedom in the digital society comes from computerized voting. You can't trust computers for voting. Elections are a special case because you can't trust any of the parties involved. Now, contrast this with purchasing something. You can't trust a business to be honest just because it's so good that no business would ever possibly cheat you. But you can tell if a business cheats you. If you buy something with a credit card and you don't get it, you'll know you don't get it and you can complain. Or if they charge you too much, you'll see this in your bills and you can complain. And given the ability to verify their conduct, they're more likely to be honest. So the point is, people trust the companies they're buying from because they can check. But you can't check in an election whether your vote was counted correctly, and you can't check whether false votes were not inserted. And the result is that you end up with a situation where you can't trust the computers. Traditional voting systems are designed to try to stop fraud. So they're designed so that everybody participating is being checked by somebody else, except the voter while voting, so that the vote can be anonymous. But aside from that, every action is checked by others, and parties send people to the polling place specifically to check to make sure fraud doesn't happen. These voting systems work in a way that people of ordinary intelligence can understand. You can teach them what fraud would look like, and then they can look around and spot fraud. Now, this doesn't mean fraud never happens, but it means that fraud gets spotted. So we get some idea that there's rigging an election. And the bigger the fraud, the harder it is. But when a computer is involved, ordinary people can't check whether it's counting. When a computer is counting the votes, ordinary people can't check whether it's counting the votes honestly or not. Only a programmer could check. But even that doesn't do any good. Suppose people that you trust checked the program a week before the election. Well, they checked a program. But how do you know the program running that counts your vote? is the same as what was checked. Maybe somebody installed a corrupted program in the morning and will replace it with the correct program that night after letting it run and count the votes wrong. Inside a computer, it's just as easy to change 50 votes into 100 votes as to change it into 51 votes. So you just can't trust the computer. We've got to vote on paper. Now there's the idea of voter-verified paper ballots. If the idea is that the voting machine will print a ballot, say, and then say, check it. Make sure that this accurately represents your votes, and then that will get saved for a recount. Well, maybe that works if people actually carefully check these papers. But an experiment was done, and they found that most people didn't actually bother to check them. In the experiment, they falsified the votes on the papers to see if people would notice. And lots of people didn't notice. But on the other hand, it also depends on taking appropriate action when people complain. Now, there were elections with computerized voting machines in the U.S. where voters said, it keeps trying to make me vote for so-and-so, and I don't want to vote for so-and-so. And what happened? If they couldn't get it fixed, then it's no use if people spot it. And the voting system is more complicated than you think. A year ago in the U.S. election, in one place, it was discovered that somebody working in the polling place was actually cheating. Because, you see, those voting machines, they had people make their selections, and then they would say, done, and then it would show them another confirmation screen saying, you want to vote for this way, this way, this way, is that correct? But most people left before they saw that. So the cheater would go in and see the machine saying, you want to vote this way, correct? And he would say, no, change it. And he would change their votes. Now, this is not a bug in the program, but it's a bug in the system that the program is a part of. The system which is bigger than the computer. The next threat to our freedom in the digital society comes from the war on sharing. Digital technology is useful because it facilitates copying, manipulating, and transmitting information. There are some that don't want us to get the benefits of this, namely publishers. And for more than 20 years, they've been waging a war on the possibility of sharing that digital technology gives us. They started with propaganda. For instance, calling sharing piracy. Now, this is absurd. What are they really saying? When they call the people who share pirates, what does that really mean? What it means is helping other people is the moral equivalent of attacking ships. Morally speaking, that's as false as you can get, because attacking ships is very bad, but sharing is good. So we shouldn't call those two things by the same word. This is why when people ask me what I think of piracy, I say attacking ships is very bad. Let's send the Navy to stop them. The most fun is when people in a landlocked country ask me what I think of piracy, and I say, I'm sure there's no piracy problem in this country because you don't have any seacoast. There's no place the pirates could be operating. Well, the point is, if you repeat the enemy's propaganda terms, that helps the enemy. So I look for a very visible way to reject them. But if they had only gone to as far as propaganda, it wouldn't be a war. They have a right to present their views just as anyone else has a right to present any other view. But they didn't stop there. They went on to pervert our technology by installing digital handcuffs to restrict us. And that was an attack on people. A conspiracy of companies to restrict our access to technology should be a serious crime. The executives of those companies should be in prison for what they've done. This is more serious than a conspiracy to fix prices, which is a serious crime. It's more serious because the conspiracy to fix prices only takes more of our money, but this conspiracy takes our freedom. And freedom is more important than money. But they didn't stop there. They saw that people were figuring out ways to break some of the digital handcuffs, so they started purchasing laws making that illegal. First in the United States. In the United States, distributing the free software that can decrypt the video on a DVD is forbidden. In Europe, generally, they make an exception for that one case, but there are laws. In France, it's the DADFSI, which is an unjust law. It must be abolished, which prohibits the distribution of software that can break digital handcuffs. The digital handcuffs should be the crime. What happens when a government passes a law like the DADFSI, it's choosing the side of our oppressors against us. It's choosing the side of the masters against the people. But they didn't stop there. They also started developing more fiendish schemes of digital handcuffs. In Blu-ray discs, there are 2 levels of digital handcuffs. One of them has been broken sometimes. That's called AACS. There's a program that can do a free program that can do AACS decryption, but it depends on a key, and they have a scheme for changing the key from time to time. Some keys have been determined, and others have not. So we can't reliably break AACS. But then there's another level of digital handcuffs which they change every 3 months, which is extremely complicated, and it doesn't seem likely that we could ever catch up with their frequent changes. So don't assume that they are incompetent or that our community is so smart that we'll always defeat them. We have to organize to defeat them. We have to shut them down, not just figure that we'll always be able to defy them. But they didn't stop there. Then they began, because they escalated their war, they abolished the basic principle of justice. No punishment without a fair trial. And we saw this begin with Adopi. The idea was punishment on mere accusation. However, the Court of Cassation decided that they had to have some kind of trial, so they put in a scheme for a trial, but it's not much of one. And then in the UK, they did it straightforwardly with no trial. It's just accusation and you're guilty. In the US, they couldn't do that. They wanted to, but it would be clearly unconstitutional. So Obama set up a private deal between the 5 major ISPs and the copyright industry, where the ISPs promised to punish their customers if the customers are accused of sharing. and no trial is involved. And the ISPs can do this because in the U.S. the customers have no right not to be mistreated. The ISPs are allowed to do whatever they want to these customers. They don't have a right not to be punished without a fair trial. But since these schemes don't seem to be actually doing very much, in Japan, they passed a law that downloading an unauthorized copy is punished with 2 years imprisonment. And if that doesn't put a stop to sharing, I suppose they'll start shooting people for it. Because these companies care about nothing as much as their profits. And they don't see any reason not to buy whatever law will help them. Oh, they also tried suing teenagers for hundreds of thousands of dollars for sharing. And they stopped when they saw that this was making everyone hate them. I haven't stopped hating them. These companies, we must get what they're entitled to. What they're entitled to is the corporate death penalty. They should be wiped out. They should cease to exist. And not just be bankrupted so that their assets would go to someone else who would start acting the same way. No, they must be wiped out because of so many forms of harm that they have done to society. We shouldn't let any organization be in that position to purchase unjust laws such as the DADC or Adobe. But they say that when they demand additional draconian measures to make us stop sharing, that they're doing this for the artists. Of course, they don't really care about those artists. They're just using them as an excuse. And most of the artists get very little money. The existing system does a bad job of supporting artists, except for stars. It treats stars pretty well. But all the other artists that really need more support are not going to get it through these companies. Well, this raises an important issue. If we appreciate art, we had better support artists. But that doesn't require allowing these companies to oppress us and take most of the money and let a little of it trickle down to some artists. So we can support artists in other ways. Now, I want it to be clear, I have nothing against selling copies of a published work. I buy such things. I have nothing against selling tickets to a concert. I pay to go to concerts. I don't see anything wrong with these practices, and I don't propose to impose any change on them. I propose other ways to support artists when we legalize sharing. Because we must put an end to the war on sharing. It's no coincidence that they keep proposing one nasty method after another, because sharing is good, and with digital technology, sharing is easy, so people share. And only draconian, nasty measures could make people stop doing something that is good and naturally easy. So as long as they're allowed to continue waging war on sharing, they will come up with and pay to enact one nasty measure after another. We have to put a permanent end to it by legalizing sharing. And by sharing, I mean something precise. I mean non-commercial redistribution of exact copies, and this must be legal for any published work. So this doesn't mean that commercial use of these works would be permitted. So the author could still charge for that, as now. But we know that the existing system doesn't support most artists adequately. So I propose two new systems, additional systems, that could do so. One operates through the state. The state would have money to distribute among the artists based on the popularity of each artist. It could measure popularity either by polling or by counting the frequency of peer-to-peer sharing of various works, and thus get a figure of popularity for each artist. Then, how much money does that artist get? The obvious way is distribute it in linear proportion to popularity, but that gives bad results. It gives too much to the stars. A star, A, can easily be 1,000 times as popular as a well-appreciated good artist, B. With linear proportion, A would get 1,000 times as much money as B, which means in order for B to get enough money to live on, we have to make A super rich, which is wasting our money, because the money that the state would distribute would, one way or another, come from us. We want it to be used well and efficiently. So I propose take the cube root. The cube root looks like this. It keeps rising, but more and more slowly. The cube root of 1,000 is 10. So if A is 1,000 times as popular as B, A would get 10 times as much money as B. Not 1,000, just 10. So the effect of the cube root is to shift a lot of the money from the few stars to the many artists of mid-range popularity. The ones who could really, where more support would really do good for the arts. Each star would still get more money than a non-star because the cube root function keeps rising. It never goes down. So the more popular you are, the more money you get. But the stars would not get astronomically more money, just somewhat more money. And most of the money would go to the artists that it's really useful to support. Now, I'm not saying the cube root is exactly the perfect function. It seems like a function that's more or less right. Which function is perfect for this is a study I don't know how to do, but it may not matter too much. It might be good. There are probably a lot of functions that would be pretty good to use. And because we could support the arts better with less money, the amount of money to divide would not have to be so much. So we wouldn't have to care too much how the state gets it. It could come from the general budget and out of income taxes, or there could be a tax on internet connectivity. The point is it would be less money than we pay now. So we should be glad. The other method I propose involves voluntary payment. Suppose each player has a button you can press to send a certain amount of money to the artists. And you can push it or not. It's up to you. If you push it, you send money. Otherwise, you don't send money. It doesn't punish you. It doesn't pressure you. It just gives you the chance to do this. Now, it should be a fairly small amount of money, but not too small. I figure that each country would choose an amount that would maximize the total sent per unit time. And this would vary depending on the general standard of living. In France, maybe €0.5 or €1 would be the best amount, I think. In Italy, maybe €0.1. Of course, I hope the rest of the Eurozone won't end up like Greece and Italy in a few years. It might. It's not their fault, after all. It's the banksters' fault.